Good morning, and good day to you. This is Brandon Tilt on healing. And this morning I would like to, talk about probably a few things, but I want my core topic to be NVC, nonviolent communication as it's referred to. And this is a technique of communicating one's needs developed by Marshall Rosenberg. And for those of you who don't know, you can look up Marshall Rosenberg. He was a, I'd say, prolific psychologist who developed this tool. He also was, I would say, a social justice warrior and spent a lot of time on the front lines helping connect communities, particularly violent communities, through this tool that he developed and applied. Kind of a hero in a lot of ways, I would say. Like, how does one define a hero? I would say, someone who puts themselves at personal risk, has the courage to stand up for what they believe in, and then also has the tools, right? I want to downplay, courage without any kind of intention or motivation or maybe even skill set is kind of reckless, and it can maybe sometimes be a bad thing. But at the same time, someone who's in the right position, who has the right type of skill set and, maybe just the clarity to know how to move through certain situations, I would reckon that person can get a lot of, so maybe it's not just about getting things done, but they can have a beautiful impact on the world. And that's also really important, right? So Marshall Rosenberg, I've been re-listening to his podcast, I guess, Audiobook. I've been re-listening to his audiobook. It's also on Spotify, but it's on Audible. And he did this at a time where, I think some people were making audiobooks. It was starting to happen, but this was still pretty new. And he basically just broke down the model and taught it in depth. And you can find him on YouTube as well, for those who are curious. If you look up Marshall Rosenberg Nonviolent Communication, there's a very long, maybe 2-hour video of him. He plays with puppets to illustrate his the difference between jackal language and, can't remember the other one, but one's representing violent language, what he calls jackal language, and the other one's, deer language, or just nonviolent communication, like actually communicating in a way that's in connection with our needs and in connection with other people. And that's kind of like the main underlying premise of NVC, is you're trying to communicate your needs effectively, but at the same time recognizing that when you do it violently, when you communicate in a way that demands your needs be met, you're no longer connected to life. You're no longer connected to the person in front of you. You're no longer able to see them truly or with compassion. You're not able to recognize that they have needs as well. So, this sounds obvious, or like you'd think we could speak our needs, but I just want to say first and foremost how difficult it can be just to identify our own needs, let alone to be able to accurately identify or even just receive when someone communicates them to us, someone else's needs, or their requests around their needs is a better way to put it. And how can I start this off? Well, how about you, whoever you are, the listener? How about you list off 5 needs that are core needs? And let's just start off with simple ones. They don't have to be either met or unmet, but just needs. The first 5 you can think of. They could be physical needs, right? Starting at the bottom of the pyramid, Maslow's hierarchy of human needs. And then moving up towards more abstract things like emotional safety and, need to be heard and understood, and need for community, and maybe just Creative expression could be one. And then it gets higher up in self-actualization, to be independent, to be sovereign, to be autonomous, to be essentially able to fulfill our purpose is kind of like one of the top, if not the top need that we as humans would be proposed to have. So anyway, think of those 5 needs. Think of them and just sort of maybe just kind of get curious about, like, why did I say that need? Is that something I'm having met? And if it is being met, how is it being met? Are you meeting that need personally? Is that a need that you kind of more or less compromise its fullest expression of, or, it's kind of like half met? Or is this a need that you really, in all honesty, rely on another person to meet for you? And then, of course, is this a need that's entirely unmet, that you struggle to have met? And even just bringing it up maybe makes you feel a little sore. You're like, oh, there's that thing again. And by the way, unmet needs, I don't want to generalize too much, but unmet needs oftentimes are the root of our personal dissatisfaction with life. They could be connected to certain emotions we feel regularly. They could be, connected to, let's just call it the extremeness or the severity of our mental health condition, right? Anxiety or depression. It could be better or worse based on how our needs are going unmet. Not always, but oftentimes. And of course, the health and the vitality of our relationships can easily be connected to our needs or our partner's needs going unmet. Or a lack of attunement to our partner's needs is often one of the, I would say, the biggest issues in relationships. But of course, that's my personal opinion. Everybody's got their own when it comes to relationships, I'm sure. I always look at needs. I find that's really helpful. It's a good place to start, not a good place to end, but you can start there. And yeah, need to feel loved is obviously one that when you open it up, there's all these other needs underneath it. So, just starting with simple needs, basic needs, even just your need to feel stable, which could be financial security. It could be eating regularly. It could be drinking water as much as your body requires, right? Like meeting these basic essentials, let's just say. I think Andrew Huberman coins those as like the essentials being your diet, exercise, and sleep, which are all kind of connected, right? So if those needs are going unmet, well, how can you meet those needs? Are those your personal, I would say they're your personal responsibility to meet those needs, but how can you seek support if you're struggling to meet those needs? And anyway, so if you've identified a few needs now and you understand what I'm putting down, you probably get it, that it's like, okay, these things we call needs, they connect us to life, and communicating them and having them clear, this connects us to ourself. This connects us to our, one might say, our wellspring of vitality, like what helps us feel alive, what helps us feel supported, what helps us feel safe. Again, these are other needs, but you know what I mean? These are also characteristics of the human being who's feeling fulfilled, or the human being that's feeling like they've satisfied most of their needs, or has resources, right? Has support when they have other additional needs which they can't themselves fulfill. Now, why do I even bring up NVC at all, other than this wonderful discussion around needs? Well, it's very helpful when you're trying to have a conversation with a person, particularly a person that doesn't really want to hear what you're having to say, or when you approach them, you feel triggered, you feel activated. It brings out a lot of anger. It brings out a lot of resentment, possibly. It kind of just brings out a type of bitterness in the way you communicate, maybe, and it triggers what's in nonviolent communication, Marshall Rosenberg calls jackal language. It triggers you to activate these violent words. It's almost like it's not almost like you are unconsciously triggering parts of you that are becoming more defensive, more coercive, in a way more rigid, and are attempting to convince a person they're wrong. And by the way, come on, this is so this is so commonplace. This is unfortunately the most common state for at least us in this Western world. When we're trying to get our needs met, we build a defense. We create a debate around it. In the academic system, in the mainstream academic system, we're taught to essentially argue, right? Create a thesis, create supporting arguments. And you know what? Yeah, that's helpful when you're trying to write a scientific paper, and that's debatably useful in the classroom and outside of the classroom in certain ways. Maybe if there's a conscious academic discussion with another peer, you're like, hey, let's talk about whatever, insert topic. And you lay out the ground rules, let's just say. Yeah, maybe that's a healthy discussion. I don't know. I don't judge. I've been known to debate here and there in the past. Maybe sometimes over voice notes. Not all the time, but as much as I used to, I suppose. But so, if it's okay to debate, sometimes we've been learned to, and we've normalized arguing. Well, what of nonviolent language? Do we naturally attune to nonviolent words? I'd say we do. But when? When do we naturally attune to our nonviolent vocabulary, let's say? When does that happen? Just intuitively. And I'd like you to maybe think about this, because it's when you are approaching something from an essentially unconditional regard. In therapy they call it unconditional positive regard, but let's just say there's no condition. You're meeting your person, whoever they are, your partner, your friend, your family member, where they need to be met. You've moved past the initial trigger. You've ideally regulated yourself a bit more. You're no longer trying to go for the throat or convince them that they're wrong. You're just kind of like, oh, I'm kind of curious here. Like, what's actually going on in this person? Or, why can't this get resolved? You could even just be curious about the problem. Maybe that starts to bring in some self-awareness where you're no longer just curious about how wrong they are. You're curious about the problem. Okay, what's the issue here that's actually making this so challenging? Bit of a meta awareness, let's say. And this is where you might start to introduce some might say softer tones, like softer language tones. But at the same time, the nonviolent language is really about self-responsibility. So that's the core of it. You're no longer shifting the focus to other. You're no longer using certain language that implicates them as being responsible for your emotions. And you're speaking in a way that takes ownership of your feelings, of your needs, of your responsibility to meet those needs. And maybe even just the recognition that using violent language isn't actually the best way to do it. So there's a kind of like an aha moment. You're like, oh, I'm curious. Is this actually being resolved in any way? Am I feeling like I'm actually communicating, quote unquote, my point, which by the way isn't really the right term, because that could be like your premise. So that could be the argument still. But I would remove the point. Like what's the point? To be like, what is the intention? Let's change that language subtly. Yeah, what is the intention for you having that conversation with your partner, your friend, your family member? Right? What is the underlying intention? And maybe even what's the underlying need, right? That's going unmet. But let's just start with intention, because if the intention is clear, you might still feel like you want them to meet a demand. You might still demand something of them if the intention is to have them clean up after themselves or something, right? Well, you can't just have that drive the way you navigate things, because there's still a motive, right? So Marshall Rosenberg, I've been re-listening to his audiobook, obviously, and he states, if you don't have the intention of essentially just like connecting to that person and understanding them, you're demanding something. You're in a way coercing them to meet your demand. You're requiring them to change, and then this is just a means to an end for them to change, to make them change. So it's just understanding what your intention is for having that conversation. Is it for them to meet a demand? Is it for them to change or to be wrong or to admit defeat, right? There's that success or failure mentality again. Or might the intention be more broad? Might the intention just be that you understand more about your partner's needs? Or might your intention be just to fully understand them? By the end of that conversation, if you fully understand what that person's been going through or feeling or why they've been doing what they're doing, well, I would say there's a difference there between them being right or wrong, because you're able to reapproach the conversation with more perspective, firstly. And maybe there's an actual unspoken need that both of you can work to address, because I love how Marshall Rosenberg also says how both of your needs ought to be met with compassion. That's kind of the quote unquote goal when it comes to NVC. If you're applying NVC, the idea is that you're meeting your need with compassion, you're just being approached with compassion, and then the other person's need is being met with compassion as well. So if you're meeting just one person's need, and then it feels like the other person kind of caves, like it's all one-sided, I would say you're not really doing the model. You're not really approaching it with a nonviolent lens, and it's tricky. Can I just say this? It's not obvious or intuitive. As much as I said, sometimes intuitively you introduce this nonviolent language, which I think sometimes you do when maybe you've exhausted all your quote unquote violent language, or you're getting kind of just overwhelmed by how strongly you're trying to meet your need, but failing to do so, and you just kind of run out of steam. But I would say, it takes a relearning of your entire philosophy of what it means to be in connection with another person, what it means to be in connection with yourself. I'm not saying people ought to be people pleasers. I'm not saying people ought to abandon their own needs and abandon their own boundaries. No, it's like this actually creates the foundation for better clarifying your needs, advocating for yourself more responsibly, and setting boundaries in ways that people are more likely to honor. So when I say abandoning your quote unquote violent communication, it means you're putting down tools or weapons, some might say, verbal and emotional weapons, that don't actually get the job done properly. They're kind of overkill. They're causing more damage than they're undoing, than they're healing. And then you're picking up a tool, which we'll call NVC, or learning to be self-responsible with your language. You're picking up a method that's actually more attuned to the situation and actually creates more harmony for both people. So, I didn't really follow the metaphor there, but let's just say this is going to be tricky without it sounding kind of violent, but you're putting down your gun, you're putting down your 12 gauge, and you're picking up, I don't know, one of those like sticks that you can twirl around that maybe isn't as effective at impaling somebody or killing them, but you're able to create a strategic balance of how that battle goes. You're able to train, you're able to effectively work your muscles. The other person can learn to defend or attack. And again, it's not a perfect analogy. I remember when I talked with Riley a while back, we were trying to compare how arguments, quote unquote, conversations, communicating your needs, it can feel like a battle, like a literal battle. But of course, I think there ought to be an absence of certain like qualities that just are inherent within real violence. So I don't want to make that parallel too close, because I don't believe they actually are all that close. But I'm using this metaphor because I think it kind of lands where, just think of how overly dramatic we are as humans, but it is when we're using certain words. So many of our words are unconsciously emotionally abusive, and that's a little bit, I'm using that term a little bit heavy-handedly, because I don't think it's always the intention or many times it's kind of like on the cusp. It's not necessarily like we're being all that abusive, but we're on the cusp. But where does this come from? Where does this desire, this dramatic, some might say even desperate desire to meet our needs come from? I would say it comes from a lack, a place of feeling like we lack, or desperation. Will anyone ever meet my needs? And you know, it also comes from a place of feeling hurt. Right? If we're feeling hurt, you know, I think of the wild animal that's feeling hurt. It's more desperate, and it's lashing out. And I feel like that's kind of like what humans are like when we're in an emotional tangle. We're feeling hurt. We're feeling misunderstood. We're not attuned to the other person. We're not connected to our needs. It's kind of a survival situation in a way. At least our nervous system tells us that, right? It triggers our amygdala. It triggers our what's called not the ventral vagal, the dorsal vagal and the parasympathetic. It's like parts of your spinal nerves that are activated when you're in a fight. You know, lots of your what do you call it? The brainstem, a lot of the brainstem, the primal fight or flight activation, parts of the amygdala, again, all about the intense anger response. Maybe it connects to certain parts of the prefrontal cortex that are connected to, actually no, probably the temporal lobe, where it's connected to memories. So you're connecting to your memories, your felt experience in the past of being wronged or being hurt. Some might even say trauma, right? So I mean, like, you're reliving some intense experience of a conflict, and then your body, your nervous system just comes online with all these intense feelings, right? Sometimes it starts in the body, right? It begins with the muscle tension. It begins with the heart racing, and then that starts to prime how you view the other person. In this one book I read, can't remember the exact author in this moment, but it was a relationship book, and it was pretty well written. But I really loved the one term that he coined called demon dialogues. And it's really just about the way that we see a person through the lens of our pain, and we see them as just the worst. They're just the worst, you know. And especially if you've been in a relationship for a long time, it's this unconscious response to having been hurt in the past, and it's your protector parts forming a perspective about a person that you care about. And depending on your attachment style, that might look different, right? Because I might be wrong here, so correct me if I'm wrong, take this with a grain of salt, but I vaguely remember that the way that you would view a person is likely to correspond to the way your parent failed to show up for you. So like if your parent neglected you, or were periodically just not there, or they were emotionally unavailable, you're more likely to be avoidant. So let's just say your parent was inconsistent. And for your nervous system, your infant child nervous system, you're clocking it that, oh, this person's checking out. They're not available for me. And in a way, you feel like you can't trust them. And this, in turn, is how your nervous system gets programmed. So that same or something of a similar feeling gets triggered when you're in an argument and somebody starts to pull away or shut down. And it might trigger parts that are like, oh man, here it comes. This is going to be just like my dad, or this is going to be just like my mom. And depending on your particular history, that could be enough. That could be it. That could be enough to trigger these other parts that come online. And this is where I'm talking about the demon dialogue. You're starting to form an understanding, quote unquote, understanding, not quite right there, a misunderstanding about who they are, when there's a part of you that on a deeper level knows this person and trusts this person and cares about this person. And, you know, you actually still love them and want to support them, but maybe your nervous system and your nonverbal cues start to reflect something differently. And then in turn, as we're speaking about violent communication, quote unquote, jackal language, your language reflects this defensiveness. Your language reflects this kind of checking out. And I would say when you're in these states, it's better to communicate where you're at, right? Like transparency, as much as possible, honesty. If you trust this person, let them in. Let them know what's going on in your body. Let them know what's going on in your nervous system. If they don't know about your history with your family or your mom or your dad, and you feel safe enough to communicate that, let me clarify. If this is your first time approaching that idea, maybe talk to a counselor, maybe talk to someone else. But if you're safe, feeling safe, you can communicate where you're at to the best of your ability, maybe even just saying that your body's feeling dysregulated. That would be a great way to frame that conversation, to prepare for that conversation, not just to jump into the NVC model willy-nilly. I think time and place is so important. Yeah, these tools work. I honestly believe they're very effective. And here I'll walk you through the model super quick for those of you who have never heard it before. It goes like this. When you do that, when you do this thing, and you're speaking to what you observe, right? You're not trying to call them out in that first statement. It's really just about like what you've observed, what they've done, and what you can objectively observe. Try not to be as subjective. Don't interpret. So they walk in the door. When you walk in the door and you put down your bags, I don't know why that would trigger someone, but it could, right? Let's just say when you do that thing, I feel, and this is where you got to be self-responsible. This is where you got to be really careful with your language, because if you use a term that says, I feel neglected, that's such a common one too. I want to say that to everyone. You can get a little bit more understanding about my wounds from that. But yeah, I feel neglected. Ugh. It's a bit of a violent term because you're implicating the other person. Remember I said that? You're implicating. You don't want to implicate. Be self-responsible. If you're feeling neglected, you're feeling neglected, by the way. But what you're communicating to the person might be sad, might be angry. It's tough to say disappointed, because disappointed is another one where you're unintentionally, unconsciously starting to point the finger. It's a bit of a shame misdirect. But anyway, so you feel angry, you feel sad, you feel afraid, you feel resentful might be one, but it depends. So I mean, like most of these terms you can look up. If you look up the NVC feelings inventory, it's got a good list of self-responsible feeling words. So you've observed the thing and you've communicated, when you do this, I feel this. And then it's about the need. So I need, so then you connect with your needs and you connect with what you need. It's also, I won't say difficult, but you don't want to communicate too many different things. Maybe just like one need to start. If there's two that feel connected, of course, but start simple, start slow. It could just, I need safety, right? And then the last piece is communicating the request with an openness that they won't meet that request. If they have no choice but to meet the request, then it's a demand. And you've already fallen off NVC. You're back into that violent communication. So it's really important that you're saying, when you do this, I feel this. And I need this. Would you be willing to do this? And it's as simple as that. I mean, it's not easy. By the way, it's simple, but not easy. However, once you practice the model or even just get familiar with your needs, you start to intuitively flow through this in ways that feel more natural. So it might feel a little clunky at first, but that's okay. Like try it and have it be clunky. Seriously. It's okay to do it in a kind of awkward way. People might be kind of like, what the heck are you talking about at first? But maybe just explain to them that you've learned this tool. It's helping you connect with your needs. It's helping you connect with and attune to their needs. It's ultimately just about better understanding each other. And most people are open to this. I think in some instances, if people are reluctant, maybe just like help them understand, redirect them towards a resource or one of those videos or podcast I mentioned, and maybe they can learn more about it. But if someone's outright shutting you down when you're trying to introduce this tool, I wouldn't say that's an immediate red flag and you need to dump them right away, but start to consider whether they're interested in attuning with your needs. I mean, maybe they're interested in tuning with their needs, and that's great. That's a perfectly normal first step. But if there's no longer a willingness to actually attune to another person's needs or have conversation, let's just say you've created the right timing. It's not just being thrust into a situation where they're dysregulated. The timing is more or less okay, and you're having a conversation. It's uncomfortable. It's going to be uncomfortable. That's okay. It's not meant to be totally easy, but you're in a somewhat uncomfortable situation. It's ideal. It's the time to have the conversation. You've learned how to do the thing. Both of you are more or less coherent. Like you can kind of figure out each other's needs. But just, is that person really putting in the effort to try to understand you and try to attune to you and maybe make sacrifices that they might have to make to be in that relationship? And again, I don't know your relationship. It's context dependent, but I would say if there's a zero willingness to try to develop the relationship or to work on themselves, that might not be the right person for you. If you're the person who's trying to work on yourself and trying to attune to your needs and really needs to advocate for you. You need to advocate for you and your needs. And ideally, in a relationship, you'll have someone who supports those needs or cares about you, right? They care about you, I'd hope. And anyway, that's not like your excuse or permission to exit a relationship that's difficult. I think relationships are going to be difficult at times, but this is a pretty good litmus test, right? If you effectively apply this tool, if you genuinely understand how to attune to a person with compassion, and there's a lack of willingness for them to do so for you, to offer you the same courtesy, maybe it's time to take stock. Maybe it's time to reassess things. So anyway, I appreciate you tuning in. Talking about NVC today. Marshall Rosenberg's got a lot of great resources. Again, find him on YouTube, Spotify, all over. There's a lot of great places. But yeah, just offering that as a resource, which I do work with clients. Sometimes in coaching it comes up. I think it's one of those things where it's best to be learned through experience and practice. And, just do your best. Do your best to learn your needs, do your best to learn feeling words. That'll come in handy regardless of whether you're in an argument. And I hope you have a great rest of your day. If you enjoyed this podcast, please leave a 5-star review on Spotify or Apple Podcast or wherever you're listening. Really appreciate that for sake of getting more reach, getting more people interested in the podcast, helping more people learn about mental health, helping them learn about quote unquote healing, whatever that means to you. And yeah, I hope you have a great rest of your day. Take care. Bye. Are you making space for your inner healer to blossom? Are you making space for that self, that deeper sense of self to shine through? If you'd be interested in working with you one-on-one, please reach out through featheroflightcounseling@outlook.com. Aside from that, go out to your favorite nature spot and pray for me, and I will pray for you. And a heartfelt thank you for being a friend. Take care.